Good morning. My name is Julio NEMEROVSKY. I am geriatrician doctor and president of the Argentine Society of Gerontology and Geriatrics. It is an honor to be able to introduce Professor Norah Keating. Professor Norah Keating is a social gerontologist whose theoretical and empirical research has created evidence, challenged discourse, and influenced policy in global social and physical context of aging. She has placed this work on the international stage through the global social issues on aging, with foster collaboration and critical thinking about aging at the interfaces of regional issues and global trends. Professor Keating holds academic appointment in 3 world regions: University of Alberta, Canada, Swansea University, United Kingdom, Northwestern University, South Africa. She is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, the Academy of Social Sciences, the United Kingdom, and the Gerontological Society of America, United States. She is past president of the Canadian Association in Gerontology and the North American region of the IAGG. In 2017, she was awarded the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics Presidential Award for the global reach of her international work. Professor Keating's lecture entitled as Toward Engaging Healthy Aging, Creating the Research Evidence to Inform the United Nations Decade of a Healthy Aging. Please, Professor Keating, we listen to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be speaking to you today on what I think is a very important period in our thinking about aging and about global issues in aging. My topic today is about the UN Decade of Healthy Aging. It's an exciting time, I think, for a new president of the association to be coming in to help us move towards thinking more globally about aging and addressing some of the really large challenges presented by the UN decade. So congratulations to Dr. Jauregui, and I will look forward to working with him and his colleagues as we create a better world for older people in all world regions. Today, I want to speak to you about research. Given that IAGG is made up of researchers from around the world, I think it's important for us to connect with big global issues as set out by the UN decade, and to think about the ways we will join up our efforts. So today I'd like to talk to you about the following things. One is to look at the UN decade and its principles, which are about values as well as about conceptual ways of looking at the world. I'd like to speak briefly about the action items where we're challenged to move forward, and then to present what I would see as a beginning roadmap for us to create better clarity and to begin to fill the many knowledge gaps we have around the region. I'll present briefly some of the work that I've been doing with my teams in various parts of the world, and then close with the role of the IAGG and how I think we can become an even more inclusive group to think about global issues of aging. The Decade of Healthy Aging has what I think are 2 components. One is a kind of a moral compass that's about values. Our work is not value-free, and aging must have, in their view, some of these important issues and fundamental principles. But also, the decade has a conceptual compass. It's a way in which we think about, conceptualize, and frame issues of aging. The moral compass has big issues, many of which will be very familiar to all of you, and which really underpin what it is we're trying to do. To think about how it is that all people would have human rights, to think more and really act on gender equality, to think much about how our countries view what's just and for whom, and then to think about how older people might have access to the limited resources we must all share. The big challenge is to leave no one behind and to improve the lives of older people, their families, and their communities. The conceptual compass is equally challenging. We talk about healthy aging not simply as an individual process, but a process that must be understood in the context of the environments where people live. We think about how across their entire life courses, older people become more advantaged or disadvantaged throughout their lives. And then about how we'll know when we've got there, the well-being of older people, their families, and their communities. It's up to us, I think, to build on these conceptual issues and to link them to the data initiatives that will give us the evidence. The UN decade has some large challenges to governments, but also to NGOs and researchers. They're large ones that are as broad as societal actions around age and aging, about communities, and certainly about care, both acute care and long-term care for older people. And these help frame the directions we might take and the policy directions that we'd like our governments to assume. As researchers, I think it's important for us to think about these challenges and to begin to address them. So we need to do our work thinking about the values as well as the actions and outcomes in the decade report. Many of us were trained as researchers to think about our work as dispassionate and disconnected, but in fact our work is social and it will influence the lives, we hope, influence positively the lives of older adults, their families, and their communities. We must think too about all these components of healthy aging and how we will systematically build on those. It's a big job over the next decade to be clearer about where we're going and to create the evidence that will tell us how well we're doing. In some of the upcoming slides, I'm going to show you some of the work that we've been engaged in with various research teams. You'll see our research projects highlighted in yellow. The first one is how we have started to conceptualize which environments we need to think about to understand healthy aging. We use the word environments often quite generally. We think about those contexts in which people live as important and that they may create opportunities or disadvantage people. We don't always specify what those are. And so I think we've got two jobs here. One is to specify the environments, and the second is to establish the priorities within them. I see two as particularly important coming out of the decade. One is our broad concepts about what we value. They tend to be national ideas, who's deserving, and how it is that we frame courses of action within our countries to address who we think is most deserving. The other context or environment that comes up a lot in the decade are community environments. The places where people live are very important in terms of how they're included or marginalized. In terms of societal environments, I would argue there are two. There has been much work done around ageism and the belief that these negative attitudes towards age really exclude people. They create inequalities, and what in the World Report and other UN decades reports has been called inequities, unfairnesses that we must address. Some of these issues of ageism are not well understood. There are two that I think need particular work. One is a kind of a benevolent ageism, that older people are worthy but vulnerable. We've seen that around the world during the pandemic, where older people who particularly in care homes, were isolated from family members and others, to great detriment of their well-being. And then the other is a kind of implicit ageism. Yes, older people are important, but other groups are more important. The second issue that I think is important and often doesn't get as much attention is another societal environment or attitude. And those are beliefs about the importance of families in being responsible for their members. These seem like highly positive values. We see them in the extent to which governments view families as responsible or assist families in providing support. Some of the European work has conceptualized two ideas about familism. One is familism by default, where families really are left to their own devices to support members, and particularly older members. The second is one in which states are actively involved in supporting families. I'll come back to that second one a little bit later. With community environments, we often think of them as physical places, settings where people live. They're also social, because it's there that people get a sense of belonging, not only to the place, but the people in the place. We've spoken a lot about communities in recent years around the idea that they're age-friendly to the diverse older people who live there, but we also know that communities can embed disadvantage for some. Some of the conceptual work that we're doing and beginning to create evidence is around whether or not family members themselves incorporate that belief about care for older people being their responsibility. This is a piece of research that we've just completed that cuts across both Southern Africa and Latin America. It's undertaken because of these beliefs about families, and particularly concerning care of older members. It's interesting that although we see families as really important supporters, we see in the Decade Action on Long-Term Care the admonition that we must not hold families solely responsible for the care of their older members. Research in Europe has shown diverse levels of familist beliefs and policies and their impact on family carers, but we have not done that work in the Global South, and hence this review that we've just completed. We undertook a scoping review that resulted in 35 papers in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, some of the main languages of the two regions. And from our analyses, we found 4 different themes. The first is that family members themselves indeed believe that families are responsible for the care of their older persons. They believe that this responsibility comes from a long-term reciprocity between them and older members of their family who took care of them. They believe also that this responsibility is highly gendered and it's primarily work that women do. and that care occurs at home, that it is quite shameful to put one's older relative into a care facility or other setting. So maybe there's no issue here. We have congruence between national values in the global South, that familism is important, and family members who also adhere to those beliefs. But there's a question to me, and that's one we have to address. We see in some of the work we have undertaken and others are undertaking in the global South that family carers pay a high cost for the care they provide, and that policies that may support family carers would go a long way to they themselves being able to have lives of dignity. A second conceptual area that's important for healthy aging is this idea of life courses, that lives evolve over time and that we must understand how these lives evolve as people grow older. We assume with life courses that they create the rhythm and the structure of people's lives. And we assume as well that those experiences that are inequitable must be addressed. As we've addressed life courses, we've thought about three, not an individual or single life course. The first is family life courses, where we need to better understand the ways in which people move in and out of intimate relations, of parenting roles, and of generational connections. And those change and evolve across the life course. What this means is as that people grow older, the boundaries around who comprises a family are increasingly diffuse as people have moved in and out of partnerships, and as relationships come and go, as people die or who are brought into families. Work-life courses are things that we have looked at in some cases, in some settings. We know some things about when people are likely to enter the labor force or to leave, and something about their transitions along the way. We actually know very little, however, about the later life courses of older adults, and importantly, of the large proportion of people whose work is entirely in the informal economy, and their work, for the most part, is not invisible. Finally, we see life courses of care, where people may be caring for others with chronic health problems at various points in their lives. Long life courses of providing care can be gratifying, but they also change the course of one's life. And we need to better understand those across the life course. Well-being is the third conceptual area, conceptualized in the World Report in Aging and Health as a very broad concept, but understood as the important outcome to a person's assessment of how their life is going. We also have a good sense that we must take action to improve well-being, and that well-being will be the metric for success of the decade of healthy aging. In our own research, we have looked at how well-being may frame research to ensure no one is left behind. And somewhat like others, we have suggested that well-being has several components. It has a material component, what a person has in terms of assets or income or land. It has a relational piece. which is about people's connections to others, both family connections and friendships and community connections. And it has a subjective component, which is that evaluation of the extent to which people are living their best lives. All of these come together to give us an idea of how well people are doing. We know that actions to improve both material and relational well-being can greatly reduce inequalities, and that it's people's overall view of their well-being. It's a good metric for the success of the decade. Let's turn next to communities and a piece of work that we're just completing on rural and remote communities in Latin America and Central, Eastern, and Southern Western Africa. The question for us is, can communities be age-friendly? We know from the decade plan and from research that community environments are important determinants of healthy aging, and we've talked a lot about age-friendly environments. There's also been global interest in age-friendly communities, but I think we haven't asked often enough, what's known about the ability of communities to actually be age-friendly? We know relatively little about these kinds of capacities in rural communities, and especially in the global South. So the question we've asked in this work is, what characteristics of rural communities in the global South are important to the well-being of older adults? Here too, we undertook a scoping review across 4 languages and a number of databases, and used the same methodology, which gave us 40 articles to look for features of rural communities that might affect well-being of older adults. These are features that don't always show up in some of the age-friendly communities work that we've done to date. They're sustainable environments, including land and water, and infrastructure, and the ability to offer livelihoods to older adults. There's strong community relationships, both partnerships, for example, with healthcare services that might be external to a community, as well as community organizations inside the community. And then importantly, the inclusiveness of cultural, often Aboriginal or Indigenous groups around their language, culture, and livelihoods. 2 things that we found that we think are important to further conversations. One is that some community characteristics that are important to well-being aren't within community control. For example, in almost all the research we studied, rural communities did not have healthcare services within the community. Those were provided by the state or the region and often were external to the community. Land and water quality and their degradation were also not always under community control, but part of larger issues such as climate change, deforestation, and so on. And as traditional crops changed based on international markets, sometimes local people lost their livelihoods. Communities may be able to manage others, such as meaningful work, developing strong relationships, and including older people. What we need to do is think more about what these mean in terms of age-friendly priorities and how we bring into discussion those characteristics that are important but are external to communities and their control. Another piece of work we've done relates to the question of whether or not families are able to provide care to their older adults, and at what cost or advantage to family members or to older people. This is a piece of work we've just completed on family care of older people in Namibia. There's an argument that care and the challenges of meeting care are high priority issues globally, although frankly, there has not been much focus on the global South in terms of research on care. There's a powerful assumption, however, a familist assumption, we might say, that in Southern Africa, people with long-term care needs are well supported by their families. Others would argue that in fact, high levels of care needs in difficult environments means that we're not able to provide the care that is needed in these settings. So we wanted to begin to add some data to these discourses of familism versus care deficit, and to better understand family care in communities and among people who are marginalized, who really are left behind. The method for this group was 6 focus groups in 2 communities in Namibia, which are quite marginalized, and marginalized because of colonial histories, because of long-term exclusion. And those we found in our findings, that people living in poor communities were marginalized already, and that those who became the carers often were further marginalized. Care was not widely shared within families. It often was left to one family member, and it raises questions for us about what it really means to be a family or to do family care. We found high levels of negative consequences among carers who are unable to earn a living, to provide the care they wish to care, and yet replicated the obligation to care in the next generation. These are important issues. I think these are the ones that led the Decade Action to say it's not sustainable to expect families to do all of the care of older adults. We see further exclusion of carers when they are providing care in these difficult circumstances. And I think there's a big challenge to not only to the global South and to Southern Africa to take notice of what's been deemed the private work of families, but to countries around the world where we've seen a drift away from supporting families towards familism, where people have no choice and no support in order to care. So what does this all mean for IAGG? I think that as a global research organization, it really behooves us to engage with these big questions, to further elaborate the research agenda, and to create evidence in a way that is joined up to inform these global agendas. It's not easy to do this, and we've tended to be quite siloed within our disciplines as well as within our world regions. I think it's time for us to begin to develop strategies about how we work across regions, both north-south and south-south, and that we build knowledge of what are issues that are similar and where we have differences. It's particularly important to include scholars at all career stages. The last 2 years during the pandemic have been particularly difficult times, in my view, for early career scholars to begin to build their career and to be invited in to the conversations that we might normally have had at places we gather, at conferences, and so on. We need to find ways to do better. We need also to foster connections with UN organizations, with international NGOs and other groups. It's these organizations that often are creating and helping move forward agendas. It's these organizations that connect with governments who are charged with making these changes. I think there's a bright future ahead for this organization, for the work that we do around the globe, and for a very successful decade of healthy aging, so that by 2020, by 2030, we can say, yes, the world is a better place for older people, their families, and their communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Keating. It was a wonderful presentation, and it was very informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Keating, for sharing this excellent presentation with us. Doctor, we have a question. What is the research process proposed by the IEGG for the social area?
I'm sorry, I'm getting two conversations, so I didn't hear your question.
What is the research process proposed by the IAGG for the social area?
I think as I've been talking to Professor Jauregui about his focus in moving forward over the next years, we've talked a lot about the social agenda. And it's interesting in different parts of the world, the social science agenda around some of these issues like communities and family relationships has been more or less developed. And one of the things that we would like to focus on is particularly looking at some of these big social issues in the global South. The work that we've been doing, looking across between regions, between Latin America and Central, East, and Southern Africa, is one of those examples. We've learned a lot about how in different parts of the global North, people in different countries view social issues quite differently. We know less about that in the global South. So that's one place where we're going to put our energies. I'm going to be actually going to a meeting in Rome this week, and I'm going to be talking to some of the people from the World Health Organization about the data sources we have to look at some of these big social issues. One of the difficulties we have in different parts of the world is that we don't have the data to support the big questions that we're asking. So how we build those, how we work with statistical agencies around the world to augment or create data sets is one of the directions that we need to take. I also think that in IAGG, we can use our regional congresses even more effectively and our country meetings to hold workshops around some of these big issues. So in some parts of South America, for example, they're doing really interesting work in Chile around environments and community environments and physical environments of older people. That might be a setting in which we could augment our understandings of what communities are like for older people and where we can make a difference.
Thank you. No more questions. Thank you again, Dr. Keating, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us.
Okay, thank you very much.